Hello students, this is Professor McDermott. Well, this is the lecture you've all been waiting for. When we get to talk about our region of the country, the Southeast, and a couple of colonies we have not referred to yet, the Carolina colony, and, of course, Georgia. So we'll talk about how those colonies were founded in this video lecture. But before we talk about those southeastern colonies, it's very important to realize that there was a Spanish presence as well next door to those English southern colonies. Now, the Spanish had not succeeded in taking over all of North America, but they did have a few outposts in what is now the United States. If you've ever been to Florida, I'm sure you know that Florida was first settled by Ponce de Leon, a Spanish conquistador, starting in the year 1513. So Florida became a very important Spanish colony just to the south of the English colonies. A little later, there were two very important exploring expeditions by Spaniards in the future United States. In 1539, Hernando de Soto began his tour through what are now the southeastern United States today, and you see a red line there on the map which shows that he started in Florida, went through what's now Georgia, South Carolina, East Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, and then farther westward from 1539 to 1542. As he traveled, of course, he brought diseases to the Native Americans in this region, and they were decimated by those post-contact diseases, of course. Farther west, another explorer, Francisco Coronado, began his trip through what's now the southwestern U.S., beginning in 1540 and lasting until 1542. So the Spanish did have a presence in North America. In fact, the oldest continuously inhabited city in what is now the United States was started in the year 1565 by the Spanish in Florida, and that is, of course, St. Augustine. So, also, the Spanish set up an important colony in the West called New Mexico, and the capital of New Mexico was the very beautiful city of Santa Fe. If you ever get a chance to go there, don't miss that opportunity, because it really is a beautiful place. Santa Fe, New Mexico, founded in 1598. In addition to the Florida colony and the New Mexico colony, the Spanish also set up mission settlements farther north along the Atlantic coastline. Of course, a mission settlement was a place where Indians were encouraged to live so that they could learn how to become Christian. Roman Catholic Christians in this case. So these are Catholic priests teaching Indians the Christian faith. And there were missions in Florida, of course. If you go down to Tallahassee, there's a great living history museum called Mission San Luis. It was one of these early 16th, 17th century Spanish missions, and they have reenactors there talking about what life was like for the Indian converts to Christianity there at that mission in Tallahassee. But the missions went even farther north into Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. And people don't realize that, but there were actually Spanish missions in Georgia and even farther north along the Atlantic coast during this early colonial period. So the Spanish were a constant presence, and they were also a threat to the English colonists because England being a Protestant nation and Spain being a Catholic one, they were frequently at war. So really there was a lot of conflict between the early English settlements and the Spanish settlements in the southeastern United States that formed a backdrop for how this region developed. All right, well, let's go back in time a little bit. Back to King Charles I. Remember him? He was the one who gave the charter for Maryland colony to his friend Lord Baltimore, the proprietor of Maryland. But after that, Charles got in trouble with his people in England, especially the Puritans. Although some of the Puritans had migrated to New England, of course, there were quite a few Puritans left in England, and they really didn't like King Charles, and King Charles did not like them, and in fact persecuted them, or so they thought. And so, starting in 1642, the Puritans in Parliament launched a civil war. We call it the English Civil War, that lasted really off and on for 7 years until the year 1649. The English Civil War consisted of the king and the people that were loyal to the king fighting against the parliamentary forces, who were predominantly Puritan. And the result of the English Civil War was a victory by Parliament, and the parliamentarians went so far as to arrest King Charles I, put him on trial for treason, and in early 1649 chop off his head. This was an almost unprecedented event in European history, and it caused a great deal of shock throughout Europe, the execution of King Charles I in 1649. And for 11 years after that, England did not have a king or queen, and it was ruled part of the time by the Parliament and part of the time by a dictator named Oliver Cromwell. But finally in 1660, the people of England had gotten tired of the anarchy, the turmoil, the difficulties after the English Civil War. And the leaders of the people decided that it would be a good idea to bring back the monarchy, to try to restore stability to England. And so in 1660, the son of King Charles I, who was also named Charles, was invited to come back to England and resume the throne, and he became King Charles II of England. And so we call this the Restoration of the monarchy, and ever since then, England has had a monarch, a king, or queen. But this is important for our story because it was King Charles II who created the colony called Carolina. Now, important to realize, when Carolina was created in 1663, it was one big colony. It was only later that it split into two halves, North and South Carolina. We'll talk about that in a moment. Carolina, like Maryland, was a proprietary colony, and this is important to know for the exam. A proprietary colony is governed by an individual or by a group of individuals. In the case of Carolina, there were 8 lords proprietors who were the proprietors of Carolina, and they basically had unlimited authority, or practically unlimited authority, to set up the colony as they wanted it. And so the Lords Proprietors of Carolina decided to produce a written constitution for their new colony. Once again, you see how important these written documents are in colonial American history. For some reason, in America, people from the beginning have felt that it was important to have things in writing, the basic framework of government, what people's rights and duties were. And so the Lords Proprietors hired one of the most important English philosophers of all time, John Locke, to write this document for them, the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina. Now, John Locke is famous in English and American history as the philosopher of liberty, the philosopher who defended the natural rights of the people against the government. And so Locke's ideas became very, very important for the founding fathers during the American Revolution, and certainly they are reflected in the Declaration of Independence. Um, and so it's not surprising that in the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, um, John Locke allowed for religious toleration of almost all Christians. In other words, um, most Christians were allowed to come to Carolina, even if they were not members of the Church of England. As long as they were Christians, they could come, and they were tolerated. The only exception to that rule, Catholics. John Locke did not believe that Catholics could be good citizens of the British Empire. He believed that their first loyalty was always going to be to the Pope in Rome, the leader of the Catholic Church, and therefore they could not be good subjects of the King of England. And so, as in most of the other English colonies, Catholics were told to stay out, but any other Christian group was allowed to come. So if I asked you on the exam, name a colony that practiced religious toleration, Carolina would be one of those colonies. Maryland would certainly be another. Rhode Island would also fall in that category. More surprising from the philosopher of liberty, John Locke, is that he allowed slavery to exist in the Carolina colony, and he was even an investor in the Royal African Company, which was the main corporation that was bringing slaves into the British Empire at that time. So we see here how people are able to rationalize almost anything if it's in their interest, and even go against their most deeply cherished beliefs about liberty, if it's profitable for them. Sad but true. But in any case, Locke allowed slavery in the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, but the proprietors wanted to make sure that the colonists had good relationships with the Indians in the region around Carolina. And so in 1682 they made an additional rule saying that the settlers were not allowed to enslave any Indians who lived within 400 miles of the Carolina colony. And by making that rule, they hoped to ensure good relationships with the Indians. However, the settlers of Carolina had other ideas. They really wanted to create a full-fledged slave system, and they wanted to create it quickly. This was very different from the situation in Virginia, where, as we saw, the slave system developed gradually. It was not part of the original plan, but it developed primarily because of tobacco. Tobacco being a very labor-intensive crop, they needed a lot of laborers in Virginia to grow that crop. And when they could not find enough white indentured servants, they then turned to African slaves, which is one way that tobacco had a huge impact on the future history of the Virginia colony. But in Carolina, the situation was different. Most of the Carolina settlers did not come directly to Carolina from England. Most of the settlers came by way of Barbados, which was, you see it there on the map, an island in the West Indies where English planters were growing sugarcane. And Barbados had a large number of African slaves who were horribly mistreated, who really were dying in droves to grow this sugarcane. It was a very brutal, repressive slave society in Barbados, and so when the planters started coming from Barbados to Carolina, they brought with them that expectation that they were going to create this kind of rigid slave system. And they wanted African slaves, But they didn't have enough money to buy Africans on the international slave market, and so they came up with another strategy. They began to kidnap and to enslave Indians in violation of the fundamental constitutions of Carolina. But they didn't keep those Indian slaves in Carolina. Why? Well, if you think about it for a second, um, trying to use Indian slaves would have been very counterproductive because the Indians would have easily been able to run away and get back to their own tribe or some other tribe. They knew the forest like the back of their hand, and it was going to be very hard to keep those Indian slaves on the plantations in Carolina. What the Carolina settlers did was enslave Indians, sell them to the West Indies as slaves, and use the money that they got from that to buy African slaves for Carolina. It was a very clever strategy, diabolical strategy, you could say, but very clever, and it worked. And so, very quickly, Carolina acquired a large number of African slaves, primarily because of this Indian slave trade that was really so important in the early history of the colony in setting up the system of racial African slavery. And so, the constitutions of Carolina, the rule against enslaving Indians was basically ignored. You may ask, why didn't the proprietors punish the settlers or forbid them from, really crack down on this? Well, they needed settlers, and there's a saying, beggars can't be choosers, and they didn't want to chase away the settlers that they had because they didn't know if they could attract others to actually come. And so, in a sense, the proprietors looked the other way as Carolina became a rigid slave system, in large part because of this Indian slave trade. Well, you better believe, though, that the Spanish were not going to take it lightly that the English settlers were attacking their Indian missions, which is what the Carolina settlers wound up doing. Soon after Charleston, the capital of Carolina, was established in 1670, the Carolina settlers began targeting the residents of those Spanish Catholic missions, the peaceful Christian Indians from the Spanish missions in Florida. In 1685, the Carolina settlers got a local Indian tribe called the Yamasee to attack the Indian missions in Florida, kidnap the Christian Indians, and bring them back to Carolina so that they could become slaves. And they did that very successfully. And so it's interesting, you see that the white settlers didn't do their own dirty work. They got the Indians to do it for them. And the Yamasee Indians, at this point in time, were very happy to take on the role of slave catchers for the Carolina settlers. And that may seem strange to us. Why would Indians turn against their own people, we might think, and sell them into slavery? Well, you have to understand that North America consisted of thousands of different Indian tribes, different cultures, and many of these tribes had been enemies for hundreds of years. And so the Yamasee didn't think of those Florida Indians as their own people. They thought of them as their traditional enemies. And they were very happy to use English weapons to get an edge on on their enemies, these Florida Indians. And furthermore, by agreeing to become slave catchers for the Carolina settlers, the Yamasee guaranteed that they themselves would not be enslaved. And so, even though it seems very like a very poor strategy on their part to take on this role, it made sense to them at the time. They saw it as a way to use the settlers to advance their own agenda, to become a powerful Indian tribe, and you see this all over North America. You know, if the Indians had banded together and turned against the white settlers early on, they would, I'm sure, have been able to annihilate all of the English settlements in North America. But the settlers used a divide and conquer strategy. They were able to turn the different Indian groups against each other and exploit their differences. And by the time Indians realized what was happening and did try to unite against the settlers, well, it was too late. Well, as I said a few minutes ago, the Spanish were not going to take that lying down, and so in 1686 they fought back, destroying a settlement by some people from Scotland at Stuart Town in what's now Port Royal, North Carolina. And so again, conflict between the English settlers and the Spanish settlers in Florida was a constant backdrop to the settlement of what later became the southeastern U.S. And that conflict was only ratcheted up a notch in 1693 when the King of Spain made a surprising announcement. King Carlos II of Spain decreed that any slave, Indian or African American slave, who could escape from any English colony in North America and who could also make it to Florida would be welcomed into Florida and allowed to live there as a free person. And furthermore, the men would be given weapons and they would become soldiers of the King of Spain. Now, this was a very attractive offer, and there were quite a few African Americans who did manage to escape from the Carolina colony, from even from Virginia, and find their way to Florida, where they were allowed to live as free men and women. And it's interesting, because later in American history, we'll see later in the course in the 19th century, if you were a runaway slave, you were trying to go north to Canada, follow the North Star to Canada, where you could be free. But in this early period, you really wanted to go south to Florida, because that was where the only chance of freedom really existed. In 1715, the Yamasee Indians finally got tired of playing the role of kidnappers and enslavers for the Carolina white settlers. They felt that the Carolinians were not treating them fairly, and were taking advantage of them. And so in 1715, the Yamasee rebelled against the Carolina settlers. And we call this the Yamasee War. It lasted for 2 years, from 1715 to 1717. It was a bloody conflict, but as usual, the Indians were not successful in this revolt. They were defeated. And ironically, the Yamasee then ended up moving to Florida, where they were actually welcomed by the Spanish and allowed to live. I say ironically because obviously the Yamasee had been attacking Florida and attacking the Indian settlements in Florida. But even they eventually had to take refuge from the English settlers in the realm of the King of Spain. But after the Yamasee War, the Carolina settlers reevaluated their policy and decided ultimately that the Indian slavery was not really worth the trouble. And so, after 1717, the Carolinians essentially stopped enslaving Indians. But by that time, really, the colony had become prosperous enough that they could afford to buy Africans anyway, so they didn't really need the Indian slave strategy. In 1719, the governor in Charleston became unpopular with some of the leaders of the white settlers there, and they revolted against him. It was a peaceful revolution. No shots were fired, but they deposed their governor, and at that point, South Carolina splits off from North Carolina and becomes a separate colony. That decision was ratified 10 years later when North Carolina was officially recognized as a separate colony. Both South Carolina and North Carolina then became royal colonies governed by the Crown of England. So they started as proprietary colonies, but like so many other colonies in early America, eventually came under the control of the crown, of the king or queen. All right, let's talk a little bit about the emerging slave system. We've seen how in Virginia, especially after Bacon's Rebellion, the system of racial slavery became a lot more restrictive, continued to expand as more Africans were brought in. But in Virginia, the situation was unusual because, as we've seen, the early Africans in Virginia were treated fairly well, and they had had a lot of interaction with white people, and they had learned English very well. For example, most of them had become Christians, and they had become assimilated essentially to white European culture quite rapidly. Historians call this early generation of Africans in Virginia the Charter generation. And in Virginia then, when new slaves were brought in from Africa, they had these experienced African Americans who had gone before them, who were able to help them adjust and to assimilate and to learn the ways of these crazy Europeans, and learn how to cope with them. And so in Virginia, you always had more interaction between white settlers and African Americans, and more assimilation on the part of African Americans. But in Carolina, the situation was almost completely different. As we've seen, the Carolina settlers wanted to create a slave system from the get-go, started importing large numbers of slaves all at once. There was no charter generation. And so the Carolina slaves really did not assimilate rapidly to English culture. They kept more of their African heritage in terms of religion, in terms of foodways, and also in terms of language. It's interesting, if you go to the Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina, to this very day, you will encounter a group of people known as the Gullah people. And they speak a language which is partly English, but also partly derived from African languages and from Spanish and Portuguese. And so it's a Creole language. It's a mixture of different languages. And to this day, the Gullah people essentially maintain that ancient language tradition. And so that gives you a sense of how different the situation really was in Carolina. It was also very different in terms of how labor was organized. In Virginia, of course, the main cash crop was tobacco. And with tobacco, a gang system, what's called the gang system of organizing labor, worked best. So if you were a slave in Virginia on a tobacco plantation, essentially you got up early in the morning and you went out to the field and you worked in a gang with a number of other slaves. And you worked together with that group from sunup to sundown, with a short break for lunch and a little nap after lunch normally. You were with those people all the time. And so you were always in company with them. This is where a lot of the early slave work songs come from these work gangs in the tobacco plantations, and some of those have survived to this day as part of African American culture. Another feature of the gang system was that the slaves did not have to grow their own food. They were provided with food by the plantation owners. Now, it was not really great food. The staple foods of the slave diet were grits and pork, but they were given the parts of the pig that essentially the white people didn't want. So they got the fat back, the pig's feet, and of course the intestines, which and so the chitlin was invented from fried pig intestines, and so a lot of these have become great delicacies in African American cuisine to right down till today. But it springs from the fact that the slaves were getting essentially the cast-off food that the white settlers did not want. But it was given to them. They didn't have to worry about providing their own food. In Carolina, the cash crops were not tobacco. Instead, you have rice and indigo, which grew better in the somewhat swampy environment of the Carolinas. And with those cash crops, another way of organizing labor worked best, what we call the task system. So if you were a slave in the Carolinas, normally you didn't work in a group. Instead, you were given an individual task to do for the day. So your master or your overseer might say, please hoe a quarter acre today, and that would be your task for the day. So you would go out and do that by yourself. And when your task was over, you were done working for the master for that day. And so, let's say you finished at 2 o'clock, then you would get to go back to the slave quarters. By the way, Carolina slaves lived in separate slave quarters, did not interact very much with white people. That was another factor that enabled them to maintain their African heritage more fully than Virginia slaves. But in any case, you were allowed to go back to the slave quarters. However, the catch was that if you were a Carolina slave in the task system, you had to grow your own food. You were responsible for providing your own food. And so the rest of the day, normally you would spend working in your own garden or taking care of your chickens or your pigs or whatever you were cultivating so that you could feed your family. And so life, in a sense, at certain times could be a little more stressful for the Carolina slaves. They had to provide food for themselves in addition to working on the plantation. However, there was an advantage to this in that sometimes slaves would have surplus of food from their gardens, or from their own small little farm plots. And normally the masters would then allow them to sell their extra food and actually make a little money from that. And so Carolina slaves had a little more opportunity for individual initiative and even to make some money from the produce of their gardens. So that's the difference between the gang system and the task system. That could make a very good short answer question on the exam. Describe the difference between the gang system and the task system of slave labor. All right, subtle hint there. I just want to mention before we leave the Carolinas, South Carolina was the first of the English colonies where in 1720 actually the majority of the population was African American, and later there would be other English colonies, later states that had black majorities, but South Carolina was the first. And so again we see there that the scope of the Carolinas as slave societies from the very beginning. All right, well, finally, we come to Georgia. And many of you may know more about Georgia than I actually do, not being from Georgia. But I do want to give you the basics here, just in case you're not familiar with the early history of Georgia. Georgia was also a proprietary colony. It actually had a board of trustees. that was started in 1732. But, excuse me, the most important of those trustees, and really the appointed leader of the colony, was a man named James Oglethorpe. Who was James Oglethorpe? Well, he was a military man, a general in the British Army. He had made a name for himself fighting in what was called Queen Anne's War in the early 1700s. So he was a well-respected leader in Great Britain. And he did various things in the government. For example, he was appointed to a committee to study the issue of debtors' prison. Now, nowadays, if you go into debt, there is, like, say, you can't pay off your credit cards or whatever. The result is going to be that you have a terrible credit rating, and if it's bad enough, you might have to declare bankruptcy. But you're not going to be put in jail just for debt in our society today. But in England in the 18th century, there were many people who were in jail solely because they could not pay their debts. And in fact, Oglethorpe had a very close friend who was put into prison for debt in England, and this friend of Oglethorpe's developed serious illness and actually died in prison as a result of this. And so Oglethorpe became concerned about the debtors in debtors' prison in Britain, and he helped to produce this report on the problem. And while he was engaged in this, he became convinced that something needed to be done to give debtors a second chance, to help them to get a clean slate and make a new start in life. And so that is where the idea for Georgia came from. Oglethorpe intended it to be a place where people who were in debt could go to start anew, and to have a better life. But as time went on, the vision developed, and actually not very many debtors wound up coming to Georgia. But Oglethorpe extended the vision to include other elements in British society: poor people, homeless people, that is, vagrants or homeless people, of which there were many on the streets of London, were encouraged to come to Georgia, where they could get land and set themselves up and prosper. Also, some religious refugees from the continent of Europe, Protestants from predominantly Catholic countries who were being persecuted, were invited to come to Georgia. And even some Jews. There was actually a lively Jewish community in early Savannah, Savannah being the first town that was founded in Georgia. There was a Jewish community in early Savannah. But once again, the odd men out were the Catholics. They were, again, the one group that were not allowed to come to Georgia. But if you cited Georgia as a colony that practiced religious toleration, I would accept that, because most religious groups were allowed to come. Georgia was also unique, very unique, in that it was the only one of the British North American colonies that actually banned slavery for a period of time. Starting in 1735, slavery was actually forbidden in Georgia. Now, that was not because James Oglethorpe really loved African Americans or had a special hatred for the institution of slavery. If you think about it for a second, you can see why slavery would really have undermined Oglethorpe's vision for the colony. He wanted it to be a refuge for poor white people from England, to give them a new start at life. And if a whole lot of slaves had been imported into Georgia early on, then they would have been doing all the work, and there wouldn't have been any demand for white labor. And so that was really the main reason why slavery was banned in Georgia early on. And in fact, Oglethorpe proved that he didn't have any great humanitarian feeling for Africans, because in 1740 he actually led a military force down into Florida and attacked Fort Mose, which was a fort right outside of St. Augustine that was staffed by runaway African American slaves who were serving the King of Spain now, according to King Carlos's decree. And so Oglethorpe actually attacked Fort Mose, trying to recapture those slaves. He was not successful, but he tried it. And so but it is important as a historical fact that Georgia was the only English colony that banned slavery, at least for a while. Now, in 1752, the Board of Trustees had really collapsed, and so Georgia also became a royal colony, a crown colony, and immediately when that happened, the King of England opened Georgia for slavery. But Georgia does have that unique distinction of being the only colony that, at least for 17 years, did ban the slave system.